Okay. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and good morning to you wherever you may be. My name is Duncan Harris, the President of the Australia-Africa Chamber of Commerce. I'm delighted on behalf of the AACC and Austrade to welcome you today to webinar 4 of our Africa Calling series. Before we get underway, 2 housekeeping matters to draw to your attention. We are, as advised, recording this session and it'll be available to our members and others as a follow-up on the AACC and Austrade websites and other channels shortly. We'll also be having a question and answer session, which is your opportunity to ask your questions of presenters. If you've not already done so, you can, in the course of this session, of course, submit them through the chat function, pardon me, at the bottom of the screen. Our topic today is Meet the Ambassadors and High Commissioners, a follow-on from the one we held last week, which was introduced by the Australian Minister for Trade, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham. In our first 2 webinars of this series, How to Succeed in Africa and How to Navigate the Corporate Map in Africa, we sought to demonstrate the merits of the partnership that we've forged with Austrade and to provide an example of the roadmap to meaningful pathways to on-ground contacts and connections to facilitate such business. 12 months ago, we hosted in collaboration with Austrade, Export Finance Australia and DFAT, the Why Africa National Seminar Roadshow Series in Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne to brief Australian companies on the great scope and opportunity for bilateral trade with Africa. Today, we're delighted to have 4 more of our Africa-based ambassadors and high commissioners to provide you with update reports on their posts. To this end, I'd like to ask Ian Halliday, Australia's Consul General Dubai and General Manager Austrade for the Middle East and Africa, and as such, my counterpart, to introduce each to you. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Duncan, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody who's joined us today. It's really a great pleasure for both Duncan and the AACC and the entire Austrade team to warmly welcome you all today, but particularly the Australian ambassadors and high commissioners to our second webinar, where we've been introducing ambassadors and high commissioners across Africa. And as Duncan outlined, we'll hear from 4 today. I can't speak highly enough of the work that our high commissioners and ambassadors do across the globe and particularly across the African continent. Our excellencies are the most senior Australian diplomats and representatives in their countries of accreditation. And they not only assist, support and look after Australian citizens, they are integral to the ongoing development of diplomatic, trade and economic relationships in many countries in Africa. They are invaluable in looking for and assisting Australian business realise opportunities. And they assist with both developing and nurturing government to government and government to business relationships. They can open doors and remove impediments for both trading businesses and investors. The ambassadors and high commissioners work very closely with the Austrade team, who also have a strong presence in the region, where we have a physical presence in 5 posts. And we're also very delighted, to Duncan's point, with our partnership with Duncan and the AACC team, another valued partner in a truly Team Australia approach in supporting Australian businesses wanting to enter or grow in Africa and supporting African enterprises who have an interest in Australia. If you saw last week's webinar, you might recall the Minister mentioning that Africa is much more than just mining and resources and education. We all see opportunities in food and agri-tech, infrastructure, financial services, health services, alternative energy, just to name a few. And between the AACC, our ambassadors and high commissioners, and Austrade, we'd only be too happy to help you out. So please reach out. There's an enormous network of people to provide you help and support. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first special guest speaker today. And I'd like to introduce Her Excellency, the High Commissioner to Nigeria, Ms. Claire Ireland. Her Excellency, Ms. Ireland, is a career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and was most recently Counsellor, Economic and Development Cooperation, the Australian Embassy in Hanoi. Claire moved to Abuja in the middle of last year, and I know she's really enjoying the role, and I'd now like to introduce Her Excellency Miss Claire Ireland. Thanks, Claire.
Sorry, Ian, I think Claire is not with us right now. Can we move on to Bronte first?
We might move on to Bronte. Sorry about that. I do know that sometimes there's a few power failures and internet connection issues with Africa. So hopefully Claire will be able to join us before the end of this webinar. So I'll move on to introducing now Her Excellency the Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Ms. Bronte Mools. So Bronte has previously worked as the ambassador to Myanmar and the deputy head of mission, the Australian Embassy in Bangkok. She's been in the role in Zimbabwe now since early 2018. So I'm sure in that time has developed some wonderful insights about Zimbabwe. So I'd like to hand over now to Her Excellency, Ms. Bronte Mools. So thanks very much, Bronte.
Thank you. Thank you. I've unmuted. I hope you can hear me. So good morning and good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much to Austrade and to Duncan Harris and his team for this opportunity. It's really welcome. I'm based here in Harare, but we're also accredited to Malawi, Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo. I'm not going to attempt to speak about them all today. I'm going to focus on Zimbabwe in the time that we have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader setting in Zimbabwe rather getting straight to the economics. There's been, for people who sort of follow Zimbabwe, you will have seen, particularly in recent months, some quite negative media coverage. And there are definitely some serious concerns and issues going on in Zimbabwe, but it doesn't paint a complete picture. So that's why I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes on the broader setting, because I think it's important. One of the many challenges Zimbabwe has is the challenge of managing expectations. So when former President Mugabe was ousted, November 2017, people in Zimbabwe and around the world had incredibly high expectations of change after so many years of repression and mismanagement. There was a sense that Zimbabwe's moment had come, and I think the expectations have not been met. Nearly 3 years later, after that change in government, I think many Zimbabweans will tell you their lives haven't necessarily improved. There's a lot of economic and social hardship. The government could have done more, a better job in some areas. But I think another thing that's really clear is that the expectations for change after Mugabe's ousting were really quite unrealistic, both in scope and pace. So I think that's something that has to be kept in mind. Fixing decades of mismanagement under the previous regime is going to take a long time. The current setting is very challenging. There's a deep political divide. Essentially, the opposition continues to challenge the results of the 2018 elections. There are concerns about rule of law and human rights and corruption, and there's many economic challenges. There's great humanitarian need exacerbated by climatic conditions, including last year's cyclone Idai and drought. And as with many developing countries, unfortunately, all the pre-existing vulnerabilities in the country have been exacerbated under COVID. It's not clear where this is all headed or how much will and capacity the government has to tackle really decisively the myriad of challenges. So it is very difficult at the moment to say what direction Zimbabwe's headed in or even to be particularly optimistic right now. But there are a couple of things we can say which are important. One is the positives about Zimbabwe are still positive. And within a fairly gloomy context, some encouraging developments are taking place. On the enduring positives, the country's natural resources and human capital still stand and are really quite striking. And then the complementarities, obviously, with Australia, notably in the mining and agriculture sector, are very much there. In terms of encouraging developments, I'll mention a couple of points because they're relevant to the kind of issues that have come up certainly in discussion with me, but also I know with the mining minister here at the Indabas over the last couple of years. One of them relates to the currency, and we've seen just recently some stabilisation in the currency and prices. This last year, Zimbabwe reintroduced the Zimbabwe dollar in mid-2019. And it's only now that we're starting to see a bit of stabilisation. It's early days on this, but what we're seeing, there's been some stabilisation that's come about since the establishment of a foreign currency auction system in June, just a couple of months ago, which has brought about this relative stability. The official exchange rate was 1 to 25 in March 2020 and is around 1 to 83 at the moment at the last auction, and it's been sitting fairly steadily for a while now. So this means, of course, prices of basic goods have stabilised over the last 2 months. Production in agriculture looks set to increase, and increased production in manufacturing. The manufacturing sector is expected to further consolidate the price stability and hopefully stimulate some economic growth. Now, the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries has commented that this supply consistency at the auction system has created confidence around the sustained stability of prices. So basically businesses are managing to secure the foreign currency they need for raw materials and for other requirements through this auction system. So this is a really big change in the macroeconomic environment. It's something that, as I said, has been raised a lot over the last couple of years. We can't say where it's headed, it's too soon, but it is just recently we're seeing these positive signs. And obviously it's important to bear in mind because productivity, of course, is a key to economic recovery here. We're also seeing a bit more interest in the oil and gas sector. Australia's Invictus, their prospecting work in the Muzarabadi area is showing some positive signs of commercially viable oil and gas deposits, and they're in the process of negotiating production sharing agreement with government. It's important to note here Zimbabwe has 5 other basins with potential of oil and gas. On the mining side, the Zimbabwe government's goal is to have a $12 billion mining economy by 2023. It's obviously ambitious. There are some concerns around issues of state capture, transparency, accountability, but some of these issues could be at least partially addressed through completion of the amendment to the Mines and Mineral Act, which is being actively worked on. In other encouraging developments, recently there was an agreement on compensation for white former commercial farmers whose land was taken under Mugabe. There's a big question around how the funds for the $3.5 billion scheme will be raised, but this has been a really vexed issue for a couple of decades. So the fact that it's at the point of a formal agreement is something worth noting. There's also quite significant work across the country to increase power generation, another thing that I've heard many times raised at Indabas over the last couple of years, but including the Hwange power station, and the aim is to become a net exporter of power by 2023. Again, very much of interest to investors, ambitious, but this work is going on. There's also 11 dams under construction across the country and road work. So this all goes to the question of the infrastructure and the support around environment in which investors might come in. And just briefly, just to touch on the issues of corruption, because it is of interest, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, which is working incredibly hard, I think has sent about 50 dockets or files to the National Prosecuting Authority this year. A lot of challenges there, but again, just a sign that there is some work going on. I don't want to overstate these developments. There are qualifications in each place. There are, as I said, a lot of ongoing concerns, a lot of uncertainty, but it's certainly not all bleak. And I think we have to look at the things that are being attempted and the intentions behind them. So the opportunities are there, albeit in a quite uncertain environment. The Zimbabwe government does want increased and diversified foreign investment, and Australia's expertise well recognised. So I guess it comes back to the point which has been made repeatedly and will continue to be made, that companies can make inroads here if the risk appetite is sufficient, if they're prepared to be in it for the long haul, and of course if they've got the commitment on the ground. So I'll leave it at that, but of course happy to discuss any aspect. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bronte. Very insightful. I might hand or we'll go now. I don't know whether Claire's come back online. Duncan, do you know? I can't see.
Ian, we've sent a chase email to her. We're trying to get her on. We don't know if it's a communications issue. We're hoping she's joining us.
All right, thank you. I'll move on to His Excellency the High Commissioner to Ghana, which is His Excellency Mr. Gregory Andrews. His Excellency Mr. Andrews is a senior career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Most recently, he was the Assistant Secretary, International Organisation Branch in Canberra, but he has previously also served overseas as First Secretary, Australian Embassy in Beijing. And Gregory's just arrived into Accra. So could you please join me in welcoming His Excellency Mr. Gregory Andrews. So, thanks very much, Gregory.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks everybody. And if I could just start off by doing something that we do in Australia, which is acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the land that we're on. And right here, we're spread all over the place. But I think it's quite an important thing to do. And also it's symbolic, I think, of one of Australia's strengths internationally, the reputation that we have as a good international citizen, and simple things like acknowledgements of countries show our respect for people and our decency. So yeah, look, it feels a little bit awkward for me being called Your Excellency, because I don't think I'm any more excellent than anyone else. And I'm new to this job. I would probably start off by saying I've got 9 countries of accreditation here: Ghana, but also Togo, Burkina Faso, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia and Senegal. So I'm really Australia's representative to 120 million people in the Gulf of Guinea, but I'll focus mostly on Ghana. And I think Ghana has an advantage for Australian companies because of its relative development compared to some of the other countries in the region. It's sort of regional leadership and also the advantage of language, as most of my other countries of accreditation are Francophone countries, but so English helps a lot. I think there's 3 things going on here in Ghana that are good for Australian business and are opportunities. And the first is, and they largely relate to Ghana's policy framing. And the first is the fact that Ghana is the host of the African Free Trade Agreement. The Secretariat is based here. And Ghana, it prides itself, and indeed is generally lauded by the IMF and the World Bank for being economically liberal and relatively open, at least in the policy settings. Second, the President has a philosophy which he calls Ghana Beyond Aid, which is really a focus on not excluding aid, but a focus on sustainable development and economic prosperity through the private sector. And the third point I think that's important is, which can be seen as a negative because it can be interpreted and sometimes result in protectionism, but there's a strong focus here on what you could call Indigenous value-adding chains, but trying to do more than just produce natural resources and export them without value-adding to them before they leave Ghana. But I think that actually for Australia represents an opportunity where we can participate and our companies can support that process of more value adding in Ghana. Traditionally, mining and education are the biggest sectors here, and actually the investment in the mining sector here in Ghana is worth billions of dollars. And multiple Australian companies from large to small are all investing here. And education is also quite significant. Both education services in Australia but also smaller niche training that's provided both here in Ghana and in Australia. And I think over the last decade, there have been over 1,000 sponsored scholarships in Australia by the Australian government aid program, but there are many Ghanaians who travel to Australia and get their educations in Australia without any subsidies. My priority, I should say, while I'm here, is to, a little bit like the President's philosophy of Beyond Aid, I think Australia, to actually capture a greater market share and to contribute to economic development here, can also move beyond mining and education. And that's not to say a reduction in the emphasis on mining and education. It's more about making sure that we don't ignore other sectors that can also be very useful. And in that regard, for example, oil and gas are significant growth areas here, value-adding chains in the agriculture sector, but also agricultural production and improvements in agricultural productivity. In Ghana, Ghana grows enough food to feed itself, but some of our neighbours here don't. And there's a lot of subsistence farming that still results in people going hungry. And with the support of Australian technology and investment, for example, there's no reason at all why people can't grow enough food to indeed export as well as feed themselves in this part of the world. That's pretty much what the science says. Yesterday, I had a really interesting discussion with an Australian who has co-invested with an Argentinian in a company here in Ghana that runs two very large on Ghanaian terms, like we're talking about 200 hectare farms, but also provides agricultural productivity and consulting services to the surrounding farms, and actually is engaged in a process of aggregating so that farmers can get their products to the market get a higher price themselves, but lower costs in terms of getting their products to the market. So that's an example, I think, where Australia, we're renowned and we have excellent agricultural consulting and technical expertise. And I think there are significant opportunities. I should mention that fraud is an issue here in West Africa, and so Australian companies need to be careful of that. There's also an election coming up in December. We don't expect any significant interruptions, economic, social or security interruptions from the elections. Ghana's had more than 20 years of peaceful transitions of power and elections. And at this stage, it doesn't look like there will be a change of government. But regardless of whether there was or not, both of the major parties here have very similar policy platforms. The other significant challenge here in Ghana is what you could call the ease of doing business. Although Ghana has really good policy frameworks and its government is really focused on moving the country ahead, a lot of Australian businesses do report that it's sometimes harder to do business here than what they would expect. And so I think it's important to be realistic there. And so really to sum up, I think Australia has a number of very strong competitive advantages that we can tap into. We're nimble and we have a really good reputation here in the region. We're liked and we don't have any baggage. And I don't need to tell Australian exporters and Australian private sector how to do your job. But, you know, my assessment from my experience over my career, not just here in Ghana, is it's all about relationships, grasping opportunities, and then taking calculated risks. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Gregory. Again, some really good insights. Claire has finally joined us, so thank you so much, Claire. You've had a very stressful 20 minutes, I assume. So how about I'll let you de-stress and I'll go straight to Kate and I'll come back to you last, if you like. So it does give me great pleasure now to introduce Her Excellency the High Commissioner to
Thank you very much.
Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy. Kate is a career officer with DFAT and until recently was the Deputy Director in the Western Australian State Office. But she has previously served overseas as Second Secretary, Australian High Commissioner in Accra from 2009 to 2012. So she's gained some wonderful experience having been posted in Africa almost a decade ago. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Her Excellency the High Commissioner to Mauritius, Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you from Port Louis in Mauritius. And I should add a word of sympathy to Claire because I did have a short assignment in Abuja in 2017 and I'm very familiar with the technical challenges that you face connecting. So congratulations on succeeding. You've succeeded where many fail. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief today. Like Gregory, I've just taken up the role. I presented my credentials to the President last week. There's really 4 key areas that I wanted to talk to you about. The first is to look at the Mauritius context. The second, to just talk briefly about the kind of Australian engagement that historically we've seen in Mauritius. Touch on some of the challenges in the COVID context and some of the opportunities that I see for Australian business in this region. Like the other speakers, I cover a number of countries from Mauritius. I'm also the ambassador to Madagascar, Comoros, and the High Commissioner to the Seychelles, but like others, I'll focus on Mauritius for today. The Mauritius context, there's many positives. It ranks first in sub-Saharan Africa in 2020 on the World Ease of Doing Business Index. So it's really tried to promote itself as a gateway into Africa, a good point for investment and engaging with the rest of the region. And that's really its focus even now in the COVID context. It currently has 22 double taxation avoidance agreements with African countries, 23 investment promotion and protection agreements, and it's set up recently a fund to facilitate investment into Africa. It has a number of special economic zones, many in West Africa, in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, as well as Madagascar, just across the ocean. Key priority sectors for Mauritius, and this builds on its past as a single commodity economy where it was totally focused on sugarcane. It's really tried to diversify its economy over the last 2 or 3 decades. Education, blue economy, fintech and food and beverage importing are key focuses for them. So there's many sectors there that offer opportunities for Australian investors and companies. In the 2020 budget, which was announced a little while ago for Mauritius, they included a number of incentives for those sectors. They have an initiative, set of initiatives to try and encourage the top 500 universities around the world to set up campuses or engagement in Mauritius. Curtin University from Perth does in fact have a campus here that was set up in 2018. And that's, as far as I know, I think it's the only Australian university that has an in-country campus in sub-Saharan Africa. The government set up the Mauritius Research and Innovation Council Special Fund, in which they'll co-contribute up to, it's in Mauritian, 20 million Mauritian rupees, which is around 600,000 Australian dollars of co-funding for researchers and organisations that want to set up partnerships here. They offer an 8-year tax holiday for inland aquaculture schemes, and they have a new program to try and encourage fintech operators to set up here. So that's kind of the context of the country. Australian engagement has traditionally been in these areas, education, as I mentioned. So currently around 2,000 Mauritian students studying in Australia and around 2,000 Mauritian students in Mauritius studying at Australian linked institutions. Trading goods, food and beverage, around $100 million a year. So a small market, but a market that's there for those that are interested. And as I mentioned, setting up the country as an investment gateway into Africa. So there's around 150 Australian companies that headquarter here in Mauritius, but operate elsewhere in the continent. The negative side, the challenges in the COVID context, I can't sugarcoat it. Like many of my counterparts around the continent, there is some real challenges in this environment. Mauritius has been particularly strict around its border closures, so the borders are still closed, likely to be closed in some way or another, at least through to 2021. They're looking at a reopening from October to citizens and work permit and residents of the country, but I can't really foresee that it will be opened up in any significant way for the next 6 months, if not longer. That has real implications for the economy. It's 25% dependent on tourism. So that has a knock-on effect for Australian businesses interested in importing food and beverage, because that's really our small market share of $100 million. It's really going into that tourism sector, and that tourism sector is effectively closed for the foreseeable future. The other challenge for businesses thinking about financial services and fintech is that Mauritius was listed earlier this year on the Financial Action Task Force grey list and on the European Union's blacklist. They are working through the recommendations and trying to address them to make sure that the international business community has confidence. But I think until they do address all of those recommendations, it's a question mark around whether the time is right for Australian businesses in that sector to invest. So where are the opportunities in this context? Obviously, there is opportunities down the track, and I think education remains a niche but useful market once borders reopen. Online education, of course, is a possibility, but there's been a few challenges implementing that here. I think the research collaboration partnerships, either between the private sector or the university system, do offer opportunities, especially with the Mauritian government's willingness to co-fund. Like Gregory, the question of food security is a really important one here. So Mauritius imports almost all of its food, and its key partners are France, South Africa, China, and India. There's a real push for them to diversify those markets, and B, increase its self-reliance. So those businesses working in agri-tech, agribusiness could find some niche opportunities here. And I guess on the investment question, apart from wanting to act as a gateway for investment into Africa, Mauritius is actually the second biggest foreign direct investor into India after Singapore. So it does offer an opportunity going up into South Asia for those that have more diversified interests. I think that probably covers off my 4 key points for now, and I'll finish there, and obviously very happy to answer questions in the discussion period. And as others mentioned, we're really here as a resource for those who want to work in this region, and all should feel free to be in contact with me now or at a later point. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kate. And in such a short space of time, you've picked up a lot of insights, so thank you. We now have Claire on the line. So Claire, you missed the glowing remarks I made earlier on introducing you, so I won't go back through that all again, but we're thrilled that you could join us today, and I'd like to really give you a warm welcome. So the High Commissioner to Nigeria, Her Excellency Miss Claire Ireland, and as I mentioned, Claire has now just been just over 12 months in Abuja. Claire, I think that's right, and really enjoying it. So Claire, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with me. And Kate, you're absolutely right. I think I cursed myself because the other day I was saying just how great the internet has been throughout this COVID crisis, and how many WebExes and Zooms I'd had, and had they been gone so well. So I think I obviously cursed myself. So apologies for joining late and for messing up, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me throughout this presentation. So I just wanted to start off with the potential, and I think that's something, when you look at Nigeria, it is the kind of the largest country in sort of Africa, and West Africa particularly. The population is over 200 million, and that's projected to rise to 400 million by 2050. So and that'll be the 3rd biggest country in the world if it reaches that level. So it's a huge kind of country, with a huge number of people. It's the largest economy in Africa at the moment. And interestingly, I think people don't often realise it's a very young population. So 2/3 of the population are under 30. So what you have here is a very fast growing consumer market. many of you would know that Nigeria is obviously very well known for its major oil exportation. So it's, oil has been its dominant kind of economic driver for the last few years. And it's got the largest gas reserves in Africa. It's also got an abundant amount of untapped mineral wealth. And I think that's something that we've been really kind of watching over the last few years in particular. And what we're seeing over the last few years, and it's been really intensified now with the COVID crisis, is this recognition of the need to diversify the economy. So they've recognized that they've been so reliant on oil that they haven't really invested in other sectors. And so that's what I will touch on in the presentation today. And what they've been doing, particularly in the last few years, is trying to create incentives for investors to invest in the in diversifying the economy. So that's the kind of the situation where we find ourselves at the moment. But I thought it worth touching just very briefly on what the economic kind of situation is. As I just mentioned, Nigeria remains heavily reliant on oil and therefore has a highly exposed price to shocks. And we've really felt that this last 6 months with the oil price going down. So while the oil sector accounts for less than 10% of GDP, it does provide around 2/3 of government revenue and 86% of export revenue. And outside the oil sector, just touching on what I said a minute ago, the government struggles to generate tax revenue. So Nigeria actually has one of the lowest tax revenues to GDP ratios in the world at around 6%. So there's a lot of structural reform that the World Bank and IMF are working with Nigeria on at the moment. It's been a challenging few years for Nigeria. So Nigeria's GDP grew at an average rate of 7% per year between 2000 and 2014. But following the oil price downturn back in 2014, Nigeria went into recession for the first time in 25 years. I know we always talk about Australia, we reached to 29 years, but with Nigeria had done so well, but after 25 years, it did go into recession in 2014. And the challenge is it probably hasn't really recovered from that, with now going into this current crisis. So growth has been muted since then, around 2% per year, and the COVID-19 pandemic has really kind of seen the country re-enter into recession, back off of a recession in 2014. So there's a lot of focus and attention on the economy, and probably that's a good thing because it's making people really focus now on how they can fix it. So that's the kind of the potential, that's the challenge. And that's the economic, sorry. And some of the other challenges I wanted to touch on before going on to sort of the opportunities. And I think you cannot deny that there's a real and very perceived risk of doing business in Nigeria. It's got a reputation for scams, it's got a reputation for corruption, which is undeniably true. But there's also, we look at the extent of the population, there's a lot of that isn't like that. But it is a challenging environment to do business. There's also a big risk around security at the moment as well. And certainly there's a lot of instability in the north, and security and crime is on the increase. And again, that is a priority for the government to address, but it is an issue that is kind of really challenging for those working outside of Abuja and Lagos. There's significant unemployment at the moment, so around 30% of the working age population are unemployed or underemployed, and there is widespread poverty. I mean, Nigeria has now overtaken India as being the highest proportion of people living below the poverty line. So you've got around 100 million people living below the poverty line. It's got poor infrastructure, so there's limited power supply. We daily, even in Abuja, 10, 12 times a day, the power's going off, so it's not reliable. Infrastructure is still being sort of developed. There's congested ports, and there's poor rail and roads. So there are a lot of challenges to doing business here. And like I just mentioned before, we are entering back into another recession, having just come off a recession just recently. There's huge potential. There's no doubt. When you look at the kind of the growing consumer market, there's absolute potential, but there are significant challenges. And I think most of you will be aware of that. So where are the three opportunities I wanted to touch on today? So I think we see, and certainly over the last 6 months as the High Commission, we've been really having a deep dive and looking during this time of, well, where are the real opportunities? Given what the government priority is and their focus, given what Australia's strengths, where are those opportunities? And I think we've identified three main areas. The first is education, the next is mining, and the third is agriculture. So education, and we've been working very closely with Austrade on this, is very much promoting the education in Australia. And we've gone from sort of 10 years ago having around sort of 50 students a year going to Australia to up to almost 3,000 now. So we've got a lot of Nigerians choosing to go and study in Australia. There's been a really strong growth in the tertiary age population, and obviously here with that young population you have here, there's a real market and interest to study overseas. Nigeria's been identified by the UK as one of the world's fastest growing student markets, and I think we would see that. Back in October last year, I participated in the first trade fair that Austrade organised around education, and it was phenomenal to see how many people had come to that and the interest in it. So there really is that demand for education. And it's not just around the kind of tertiary education or university, but there's real strong potential for delivery of the online and the VET education, so vocational training. So that's a real market, I think, that we're excited to kind of look at exploring, and potentially the kind of the ways for online opportunities and things like that. The next area is mining, and I think it's an area that, you know, there's been a long engagement by Australian over a number of years. And I was looking through some of our archives the other day, and back in the 70s, we even had mining visits go over to Australia. So it's an area that we've been kind of working with for a long time, but it's still very underdeveloped. It's a government priority in terms of this diversification agenda, recognising to move away from the oil sector, that's the untapped potential of the mineral sector. And there's no doubt there is abundant mineral wealth. There's a lot of studies going on at the moment to map the geological, the minerals in the ground, and there's a World Bank project and a government project, both looking to do that to try and get that kind of information out there. And the intent is to get it onto the internet to make it available for people to have. And like I said, Australia has a long history of technical assistance in the areas, and Australian companies who have been sort of early operators in the sector, but we're still kind of very early days. There's only one internationally stock exchange listed company who's operating here, and that's a Canadian company in the gold sector. We have Australian companies here who are very kind of investing and very close to kind of getting to that next level, but it's still very kind of challenging in terms of relationships, in terms of securing tenure, ensuring that the community leases are in line with the lease of the mines, and there's still work going on in that area. They have introduced tax incentives for companies operating in the sector, and that includes a 3 to 5 year tax holiday. So they are kind of trying very much to kind of create that incentive to get businesses to come in. And there's no doubt, when I talk to the mining minister and the Minister of State, they are very interested in having Australian companies come in. They see our reputation, they see that we are kind of the world leaders, and so there is a lot of interest to kind of tap into that and to get that interest. So normally Nigeria would send a delegation to Africa Down Under because they are keen to kind of get the Australian investment. But so mining has potential, but it's still very, very challenging. And then lastly, agriculture. It's an area we haven't really done a huge amount in terms of Australia here, but I think what we recognise is it's a priority for the Nigerian government, and so there is potential, but we haven't really explored it yet. Agriculture accounts for 25% of GDP here. It's not self-sufficient in most food products, and it's a familiar story to Mauritius, everything's imported. But what the Nigerian government is trying to do is actually kind of to create that kind of actual agriculture productivity here in country. So I think we're seeing opportunity for services, for technology here in Nigeria, potentially from the Australian side to help feed into that. The quality of the land is phenomenal here, but the actual productivity is very low, and the incentives for kind of agriculture hasn't been there, because with the oil exports, they've been able to import everything. So at the moment, agriculture is very much hampered by poor yields and technology and infrastructure. There are opportunities in dairy. I think we see cattle breeding, logistics, storage, seeds, irrigation, packaging. So very much around that sort of services side that I talked about. And again, the government has introduced tax incentives for investors, which includes a 3 to 5 year tax holiday and no import duties on equipment. So they're looking to try and get that investment to come in country. So I think at this moment in time, those would be the 3 areas where we feel there is the greatest potential here in Nigeria, but not without those challenges which I talked about at the start. Just to finalise and put the kind of the current context in place, obviously with COVID-19, there has been a real halt on the economy, and with the oil price going down, that really hit the local kind of economy very hard. Nigeria has now opened up its international airports again, so you can come in and out, which is, it's been a huge kind of relief, I guess. They've introduced new quarantine measures, which has reduced it to 7 days quarantine when you come in place, but it is something they are taking seriously. And so quarantine is very much implemented. If you come into Nigeria, the international flights are open again, but they're not nearly as many as before. And we still have like curfews in place where you have to be in home between 12 in the morning, and the economy is starting to open up again. So it's starting to rebuild and starting to look outwards, but there are these measures that one has to bear in mind if they are going to be coming over here and working in Nigeria. So let me end there, if that's okay.
Well, thank you, Your Excellencies, for your very wide-ranging and insightful presentations. I'd now like to introduce you to our Q&A moderator, Andrew Patterson. Andrew is Head of Business Intelligence for the AACC, and hopefully he's got some intelligent questions to ask as well. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Duncan. And thank you all for your excellent presentations. I feel I know a lot more after a compressed delivery from you of 10 minutes each. It's been, I think you've touched on some great points. I thought I might, perhaps with Ian's assistance, just direct my questions to you as a panel, and perhaps Ian, if necessary, could allocate someone to, or one or more to answer. And the first question I thought is probably something that is certainly very topical. Maybe you've been asked before, get asked a lot, and that is the impact of COVID. And I'd like to get your soundings on the impact of COVID at both a strategic and a tactical level from the point of view of business people. At a strategic level, for example, is the health and the indirect economic impact likely to lead to significant long-term and lasting strategic shocks to things like institutions, power politics and dynamics, access to extended finance, power balances and so on. So that's the strategic level, because Africa is a vulnerable part of the world and institutions will be under pressure. And then at a tactical level, just thinking from the point of view of Australian business leaders, especially those considering entry to or expansion in Africa, tactically, what can Australian businesses be doing during the sort of hiatus that's applying in these, that we've had 6 months of pandemic, and it looks like it's likely to continue. I think the world statistic is it's infected about 0.25% of the world's population. So I guess there's more to come. So Ian, it's a long question with two parts. I'll take your advice on how that can best be answered in a panel sense.
I just wonder who'd like to go first of our High Commissioners and Ambassadors.
I might jump in, Ian, from Mauritius.
Right. All yours, Kate.
So Mauritius is probably a little unusual to the others in the sense that you can operate here from a COVID perspective. It's COVID safe. They've been able to seal their borders. The challenge is you can't get here at the moment. So if you were a business already here, it's quite a good operating environment. Andrew, you touched on a really good point about even in an environment like this where COVID hasn't run rampant, the economic impacts are having larger strategic impact. So we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks in Mauritius, for the first time in its modern history, some really widespread protests against the government, and people are protesting about the unemployment arising from COVID, some other environmental and other issues, complaints about corruption. But I think you're absolutely right for the entire continent that we should expect some degree of instability or political blowback from the economic effects of COVID. And then the other point I'd make about Mauritius is that the areas that it wants to focus on, like financial services and education, do lend themselves to virtual engagement, although, as I mentioned, on the financial services side, the country does need to work through some of the criticisms that have been directed at it from the Financial Action Task Force. So perhaps down the track, that's an option. Thanks.
Thank you. And perhaps an answer from one or two countries in mainland Africa too.
Yeah, I think Claire put her hand up to respond as well. Thanks,
Yeah,
Claire.
no, so, yeah, in terms of the impacts of COVID at the strategic and technical level, I guess, so the reality is on the economy, we have seen an increase in unemployment, there's been an increase in protests, crime has gone up, kidnapping's gone up. So, those indicators aren't good. In terms of the health, we know that there's widespread community transmission, but we don't know how much because they're not really testing. The Centre for Disease Control are going to be doing an epidemiological survey in the next month, and I think that will give us a much better indication in terms of what the actual situation is. So whilst that's a pretty negative picture, on the plus side, what I think has happened is it's really forced the government to address some of these economic challenges, which they've been sort of trying to kind of tackle, but at a much slower pace. And so now you have a much more focused kind of engagement by the government. The Vice President put together an economic sustainability recovery plan to get through the next year, which was again very much creating an employment incentive to get the market going. And there's now work going on a 2050 blueprint by the Nigerian government as a recognition that also politically the next elections are the next 3 years, and so the current president wants to leave with some good wins behind his name. So what we have now is a real focus on getting the economy back on track and right, and there's incentives in place. So whilst the kind of the human indicators are not very good, on the economic side we're seeing that kind of real drive for change. So I wouldn't rush, but I think in the next year we will see some positive economic reforms taking place, and the World Bank and IMF are working very closely with Nigeria on that.
Thanks, Claire. Bronte or Gregory, any further comments to add?
Sure. Happy to jump in. Ian, thank you. Yeah, look, I guess building on some of the other comments, the strategic impact is undoubtedly severe. I think I made the general point that all the pre-existing vulnerabilities have been exacerbated in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, certainly any developing country, but also developed countries. So it is quite shocking in many respects. For Zimbabwe, it's interesting because, in January this year, before things got really bad with COVID, things were looking pretty bad. And as I said, now they're worse, but the relativities have maybe evened up a bit, and that so many countries are in dire straits now, it kind of, in relative terms, there's a bit of an opportunity for Zimbabwe not to stand up so badly. And also, I think there's the opportunity, as Claire referred to then, in this sort of environment, there is scope to take tough economic decisions and to undertake tough reform measures. I don't think we're seeing that very decisively here yet, but it does create a bit more scope for that, because it becomes, I guess as things become more desperate, there is that scope to take that decisive action. We'd like to think we'd see some more of that, but it is hard to tell. I know in other parts of the world, I think in India, we've probably seen a little bit of that, where governments can use it to take those, push through the tough reform measures. But yeah, on the whole, at this point, I'd say, sadly, it's an exacerbation of all the things that were challenging already, which will have long-term implications.
Thanks very much, Bronte. Gregory?
Thank you. Actually, the first thing I would say, just to respond to your first question about COVID in Ghana, I think Ghana is doing really well adapting to and living with COVID. And, I actually arrived here in July, and it took me 4.5 days through 5 countries to get here, just with the aviation sector in relative disarray. And Ghana now has on-arrival testing, and one of my second secretaries just arrived and flew exactly the same leg and exactly the same amount of time pre-COVID, like from Sydney to Dubai, and then Dubai direct to Ghana. And on a day-to-day level here, the Ghanaian people and Ghanaian businesses, they've moved on from fear to an anxiety about COVID to pragmatic adaptation. So hand washing, masking, hand sanitizing. So apart from cinemas and, large sporting events, everything's open and businesses operating obviously in an adaptive way, and the economy definitely has been affected. But I think that here in Ghana, I really congratulate them for adapting and protecting people. It's very safe here in Ghana. The death rate is relatively low. The testing rate is high. And indeed, I've just, advising the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that it's time for families to come back. And I'm looking forward to my family joining me, and I know that they'll be just as safe here as they are in Australia. So my message would be Ghana's open for business during COVID and adapting to it.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. We might have time for just one more question. And one of the questions that's come up on chat is about Australians wishing to offer courses to African students. You've all mentioned education as an important area, and I guess that extends from not only university education, but to secondary education, and then into the non-university tertiary sector as well, training and that sort of thing. And I'd be interested if perhaps there's just time for a couple of answers here. Is it feasible, and how feasible is it for Australian companies to become more involved in delivering educational product and services to Africans in Africa without them actually coming to Australia? Are there markets there? Are there untapped opportunities? Again, Ian,
Can I jump in from Mauritius quickly, just to say yes, and particularly doing that in partnership with a local partner, which most of the Australian universities and vocational institutions do here in Mauritius, but also as a plug for Mauritius that they want, where travel to Australia is not possible, particularly, for example, Curtin University with its campus in Mauritius, they're looking for ways to get African students to study an Australian course in Mauritius. So that's another way to think about it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd agree from Nigeria side too. Back at the start of COVID, Austrade helped facilitate this online free learning platform, and Nigerians were quick to sign up on it, and I think we're one of the highest to sign up from Africa. And so there is a huge potential and huge interest. You've got a very good market growing here. I think, particularly with the challenge of traveling right now, that is where the opportunity comes. I think, like Kate said, it's working in partnership. It's ensuring the quality. I think that's going to be the challenge. Is really ensuring you've got that quality and you can deliver on that. But there is no doubt that there is a high market for online learning here in education.
I might just add in there too, Andrew, just to add some comments. I think there's opportunities for both. To Claire's point, with no travel at the moment, it's very difficult to, and no visas being allocated to get students to Australia. But to Kate's point, there is a sizable presence by Australian universities in Mauritius offering what they call transnational education. And to Claire's point, we've had an amazing take-up of online delivery of education services in the past 6 months since COVID. So we really want to capitalise on that. And there is opportunity too for vocational training. And I think to Kate's point, it is about finding the right partner, and it might be an Australian organisation already operating in Africa, and how do you partner with a commercial entity to help with developing their own workforce. So we see enormous potential. And just one point that Claire raised, last year I was talking to the Minister of Education in Mauritius, and she said right now in the age demographic 15 to 24, across Africa there's about 200 million people. And the population's due to explode in that age demographic to 800 million people in the next 20 to 30 years, many in Nigeria. So, and of course, many other countries are looking at Africa from an education perspective, and I think Australia's got some fabulous opportunities and capability to help educate African continent. So I think the more people who've got some interest, but again, it's being a bit selective between tertiary as well as vocational. But I think there's enormous potential there.
Thanks, Ian. It is really exciting, and there'll be people that are looking back in even 5 years, but certainly 10, and wishing that they'd actually taken this opportunity to get in at what is a bargain basement level at the moment. I think that runs us out of the time for questions, and so I'll hand back. Thank you all very much for your terrific answers, and thank you, Ian, for just coordinating that. And now I'll hand back to Duncan.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And for those whose answers we've not responded to at this time, we'll take them offline and endeavour to get back to you to respond to you accordingly. But I would in particular like again to thank our ambassadors and High Commissioners for their thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations. Also special thanks, of course, to Ian Halliday and his Africa-based team, And of course, a very big thank you to all of those who've joined with us on this webinar. We hope, as Andrew was just indicating, that it'll provide you with the all-important inspiration and aspiration for you to pursue your business goals and ambitions with Africa. And we hope that you'll also see that the AACC can provide you with invaluable advice and support to do so. And we'd strongly encourage you to become members to have you gain access to that support. Just click onto our website and become a member today. Finally, we have a range of themed webinars in the pipeline, and you'll be shortly receiving more information and invitations to attend them. We thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, one and all. Much really appreciated. We look forward to
Thanks,
downloading and
everybody.
distributing your materials. I'm sure it'll be of consequence, but thank you again.
Did a great job, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Andrew. It went well.
Yeah, that was good.
We'll be back in touch about the next slew of webinars, Ian. Watch this space.
All right, sounds good. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks, one and
everybody.
all.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Take care.
All right.
All right, thanks very much. Bye-bye.